Howdy, y'alls. Welcome back to Anthropology 111 with me, Dr. Edwards. This week, we're diving into our Module 7, all about globalization, modernization, and technology. So, I want to start off this week actually trying to give a real solid definition to technology, because we often think about technology as being computers, digital stuff, things like that. From an anthropological perspective, technology is just knowledge, skills, and tools, all right? And it exists in all sorts of forms. So in this perspective of technology, a bow and arrow is no different than a computer, all right? They are knowledge, skills, and tools, all right? And I also want to stress that we don't want to suggest that some forms of technology are better than others, right? You may have your personal preferences. That's great, right? But we don't want to suggest that because a group uses this particular type of technology, they are better than or less than another group, all right? So let's get into globalization a little bit since we have a nice kind of baseline of what technology is, all right? I like to put forth that globalization really is nothing new. All right, at its most fundamental level, globalization is the process that occurs between different people and different places. Right, at its most basic. Right, but when you kind of pick that apart, we can see that globalization tends to have two key aspects to it: an economic aspect and a cultural aspect. All right, oftentimes they're woven together. All right. So one may, support the other and back and forth. All right, they're intimately connected. Um, and our text gives some really nice examples of that. Now, from a broader perspective, when people think of globalization, they often think of a very Western centric model, right? Where it's the West to the rest, right? There's actually a guy named Wallerstein that wrote an article called World Systems Theory. And in it, this pretty much is the basic model for this Western centric idea of globalization, that all groups want to be like Mike, right? If you remember those commercials or were around for them, that the West dictates to the rest, that the West serves as some core and expands outward from that. Right? And there's some really good examples of this. I mean, colonization is a great one, right? We saw European powers go and politically, economically control other areas, right? But I want to be really clear to suggest that that is just one model, right? This kind of west to the rest, core to periphery model. And I gotta say, it's very Western centric. All right, it presupposes that the West is the best, and everyone else wants to be like them. Well, this presents some problems from an anthropological perspective, because it robs people of their agency. And agency is the ability to pick and choose, to serve your interests. And so this Western centric model really kind of doesn't allow for that. It's this unidirectional idea. Now, I want to put out there that there are alternative models to globalization. In fact, all my research is, into wildlife use is really all about that. And let me give you kind of an example. So we have international conservation law that says that this species is protected and that species is threatened and you can't harvest that one, and all of those ideas, those values are Western, right? They come from Western conservation groups. Nothing wrong with that, but what you'd expect to see from a Western centric model is that everyone then adopts those practices, right? That everyone is like, oh, okay, this animal is protected, therefore we shouldn't hunt it, we shouldn't use it, we conserve it, that sort of thing. But what we actually see is something very different. We see people picking and choosing to serve their interests. Right? I worked for over 10 years with wildlife use in West Africa, where folks actively, made choices that served their interests that were not necessarily Western interests or values. Okay. Yeah, in fact, in one of the markets that I worked in, it was a tourist market geared toward foreign travelers, predominantly Westerners. And one of the key things they sold were these wildlife products, things, commodities made out of wildlife, like a Nile crocodile wallet, a black cobra belt, things like that. Right? Now, some of those species, or lions, leopards, some of these are protected by international law, but they still harvest them and use them. And when you ask them why, they like, well, you Westerners are the ones that want them. So that's a great example of a counter example to Western centric ideas of globalization. It really underscores that individuals in other places pick and choose to serve their own interests. Okay? Now, I also want to suggest that it's not necessarily one or the other, that it's, Western centric or agency based, but that we may actually have mixes of these, all right? Because we can see the McDonaldization, sorry, that's a tongue twister, McDonaldization of the world. We can see how there are particular things that are spread, and they reflect Western values and norms. But if we kind of take a combination of this Western-centric and agency-based approach, we might be able to see that, okay, well, these people adopt that because they have a value for it, or they adopt that value. Sometimes we often think of that being forced, and that's kind of this kind of gray area that we want to be careful with. There are examples where other people in other places are literally subjected to foreign values and norms. Okay, but that's not all, and that's kind of my point. That you got to kind of take each example as its own, and when you put them all together, it reveals a broader perspective, right? That it's not one model or another, but we see different sorts of examples of all those models. So, yeah, moving on here. I've touched on colonialism before. Shared a video about King Leopold's Ghost. It's a great documentary. If you're able to see the whole thing, I really recommend it. But at least check out the previous trailer that I posted, because it gives some. You think of that as a historic example of a very Western-centric model of globalization. Now, there's another topic that's brought up in this week's readings, and that's the topic of structural adjustment. Now, in many ways, well, actually, let me give you a little background. This really started in the 1960s when colonized countries gained their independence from their colonizers. Right? And what tended to happen was the colonizers beat a quick retreat and left the country in shambles. And these countries were impoverished, and they had to turn to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to get loans to support themselves. Right? Now, a key condition to these loans was that they had to be repaid, and if they weren't, that the grantees of the loans had the authority to adjust the structures of that country to get their money back. Essentially, the banks if the loans weren't repaid on time and in full, the banks got to go into that country and reorganize it to get their money. Now, that's compare that to, like, defaulting on a home loan, right? Worst case, you lose the home. You may go bankrupt. Somebody doesn't come in and restructure your entire life to get the money back. They'll try to get their money back, but the point is, this is at a large scale, a societal scale. And I got a nice article in this week's written portion of the announcement about global dependency that's created through these structural adjustment programs. Intensifying Global Dependency by Bradshaw and Hung. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Haung. Excuse me. And yeah, I mean, it's a bit dense, but I highly recommend you check it out because it really highlights some of the fallout of these structural adjustment programs. And it affected a significant portion of the world and still does. Now, kind of associated with that is this idea of development. We often talk about underdeveloped countries and or developing countries, and we often associate with this idea of development this idea of modernization. And this is actually why many people think globalization is very Western centric, because modernization is all about how science and technology are the appropriate path. It's based on a Western model, all right, a European model, historic examples, and that this is, the best route to develop. Now, of course, we can point out some serious ethnocentric ideas with that. It's one idea. It is not the idea. So yeah, I've worked in development a lot. I actually started as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa doing local development, and I saw all sorts of things. I could sit here and go on and on about that, but what I really want to kind of underscore is that a lot of the development that we see is reflective of Western values, all right? And that tends to support that Western-centric model of globalization. Now, there are other examples, all right? So we want to keep those in mind. There's a great video that I share in this week's written portion of the announcement by Wade Davis. It's a TED Talk, and he gives some great insights into the impacts of development and globalization on indigenous communities. He's an anthropologist, works for National Geographic, and he gives some really great insights into the effects of these systems on marginalized communities. I also share a link for Survival International. Check them out. This is a group dedicated to advocating for indigenous rights. They do some cool stuff. One last thing I wanted to touch on briefly is environmental issues. Right? This is another key theme within globalization, modernization, and technology that the development often has environmental costs. Okay, and it also sets up kind of Westerners who have experienced industrialization, have seen the costs of it. They tend to suggest to developing countries that you should follow a certain path to avoid some of the pitfalls of industrialization. Now, when you're living off of less than $2 a day, right, which a significant portion of the rest of the world does, these choices, right, are not necessarily the ones that you'll make. And again, that kind of underscores the agency, right? Making the choices that serve your own interests. And we can see today. I mean, we live in the Anthropocene, this era that is defined by human activity, right? We've redefined the entire landscape of the Earth, pretty much. We've expanded to every nook and cranny. We extract natural resources to support ourselves, and these have significant costs. Now, I teach other classes on human environmental relationships and stuff like that, so I don't want to get too off on the deep end here. But it's important to recognize that these costs accumulate at a global scale. They impact everyone from a local scale all the way up to a global scale, right? There's another way of looking at it. So yeah, be sure to check out the extra resources that I share this week. And I'm really looking forward to your final projects. Hopefully you've been taking my feedback to heart and applying it, and it's going to make all the difference. You'll see down at the bottom I got a sample paper posted for you to check out. I also have a graphic that helps you kind of align the various parts of the final project with the things that you've already done, and it highlights what you've done, where to put it, and what you need to do, and where it goes in the process. So that's where I'm going to leave this little video overview. And of course, if you have any questions, any concerns at all, don't you hesitate to get a hold of me. I'm here to help. I'm happy to go over other examples. Yeah, whatever you need. Hope you all have a great Father's Day and take care. Bye.